When Abraham Lincoln was president, he had little time to give serious thought to the importance of Jerusalem. But today, Jerusalem is that burdensome stone that the prophet Zechariah talked about. It appears to be an intractable and unsolvable dilemma, but what you're about to hear could change all of that.
By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. For there they that carried us away captive required of us a song, and they that wasted us required of us mirth, saying, Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth.
These beautiful and majestic walls of the ancient city of Jerusalem are a constant source of pride and comfort to the Jewish people. It's as though the arms of God have enfolded the city, bringing them peace. But in many ways, the Jewish people are not at peace. They're constantly on edge, wondering who will be the next to attack them and perhaps tear down these walls once again. But the walls also echo down through time with the voice of the psalmist who said, never to forget. And though much of Jewish history has been forgotten and been replaced with folklore, legends, and myths, there's one thing that will never be forgotten, and that's because it's etched into their very DNA, and that is, they have a covenant with destiny. Hello, I'm Ken Klein, your host, and I want to take you on a journey back into time, an amazing journey, seeking to rediscover the lost histories of the Jews, histories that once brought into the light of day will change everything. You know, it's not hard to understand why there's a corporate amnesia with the Jewish people concerning their histories. Because when the Romans came in 70 and destroyed this city, I mean, they tore down the walls, they destroyed the temple, they destroyed the city. There was nothing left. 1,100,000 people were murdered and thrown into the Kidron Valley, and many were sold into slavery. 60 years later, at the Bar Kokhba revolt, another 600,000 Jews were murdered, and the Emperor Hadrian changed the name of Israel to Palestine, and he changed the name of Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolina and banished Jews from ever living in this land again. And for 1,000 years, there was no Jewish presence in Israel or in Jerusalem. So it's not hard to understand why there's been a lapse of memory and why there were no record keepers to remember where the walls were, where the city was, and most importantly, where the temple was. The consuming desire of Jews ever since the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, even to this day, is to rebuild their most cherished and loved temple. But this long-held and deeply embedded desire has been severely frustrated, and by and large, it is from the void and gap in their understanding of their own shattered history. Having been disenfranchised from their own land for many centuries, and then trying to parse together with scant information as to the whereabouts for the location of their temple, has inadvertently created an unsolvable problem and has dragged the entire world into the ensuing fray. The prophet Zechariah predicted that this would happen when he prophesied that Jerusalem would become a burdensome stone to all the nations of the world, and so it has. And this is because the Jews believe that their temple that was destroyed and is to be rebuilt is at the very site and location of the Muslims' Dome of the Rock shrine. Here they come daily, and even more so on the Sabbath day. The multitudes come to pray, to beseech God to allow them to rebuild their temple. The ensuing controversy over this 35-acre piece of real estate, called the Temple Mount, now threatens to bring the whole world into a third world war. This location, called the Wailing Wall, which is deemed the most sacred spot in all of Israel, is a fascinating place with so much religious activity and thousands upon thousands of Sabbaths and so many prayers, thousands of prayers jammed into the cracks of the wall of the Wailing Wall. The question I'm about to ask is almost unthinkable. In fact, in some circles, it might even be considered blasphemy. And that question is this really the site where the Jewish temple was? And in other words, just above this wall is where the Jewish people believe the temple, their precious temple, was built. And this is their retaining wall, the Wailing Wall. And so, if it's not the site, and this is merely the retaining wall of the Fortress Antonia, then this would be the cruelest of irony. But is it remotely possible that the Jews' temple does not belong up on top, where the Dome of the Rock defiantly sits? The crushing weight of Jewish tradition refuses to allow such an inflammatory and repugnant question. But a more critical question that trumps this colossal consensus is this: would God himself allow for his temple to be rebuilt where it does not belong? And this very question begs for the answer. But the only sure way to know the answer is to revisit and examine the facts of history in archaeological discoveries, Holy Scripture, historical writings, and eyewitness accounts, and then analyze these forensic facts and determine what they are trying to tell us. We're on the west side of the city of Jerusalem, and this is the famous Jaffa Gate. There's 7 gates that enter into the old city. And in order to delve into all of these facts that we've presented and make sure they ring true, we're going to have to go back in time to the 1st century. So follow me into the old city, and we'll begin our journey. Traveling back through time and reconstructing the past is no easy task and is fraught with many problems. In order to recreate historic moments in time, there is tremendous need to have accurate information. And when it comes to the history of Jerusalem in the 1st century, it can be even more complicated and daunting. There are significant problems that must be recognized if we are to successfully navigate our way back into the past. Not only does the time traveler have to sift through layers and layers of archaeological ruins, but then there are the myths, legends, and endless religious traditions that shroud the past. The myths, legends, and religious traditions are difficult barriers to overcome because they become deeply ingrained in a culture as they are passed down from father to son, generation to generation, and then century after century. These present huge, formidable obstacles in our time traveling. As we journey back into the 1st century Jerusalem, we begin by first taking a look at the Old City. What is called Old Jerusalem today is a walled city that surrounds not only the Temple Mount area, but also a city which has been divided up into 4 quarters. As we enter through this Jaffa Gate, we first come to the Armenian Quarter. Then, just to the north of the Armenian Quarter is the Christian Quarter, with its fabled Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Then east of the Christian Quarter is the Muslim Quarter. Then finally completing a circuit to the south is the Jewish Quarter, just sitting below the Armenian Quarter. Upon entering the Jewish Quarter from the west, we come to a most significant archaeological ruin, a ruin that sheds light on why time travel in Jerusalem is so difficult. What we see below is an archaeological dig that unearthed the ruins of a 7th century market called the Cardo. It was built by the Roman Emperor Justinian. Look how deep it is from these ruins to the existing ground surface of the Jewish quarter. These stairs lead down some 20 feet. This means that Jerusalem in the 7th century was 20 feet deeper than the surface you see today. How much deeper was the city more than 600 years earlier during the 1st century? But then there's another problem for those trying to imagine the past. When you come to Jerusalem and come to the Old City, you begin to think, when you visit streets like this, that this must be what Jerusalem was like 2,000 years ago. And they call this the Old City, and you can very easily make that mistake, but this is really the new Old City. The Old City was 500 years younger than this part of town. Nevertheless, people begin to extrapolate and imagine that this must be what Jerusalem was like 2,000 years ago. The point is, what is called the Old City from the 1st century standard is not old at all. In fact, what can be called the real Old City of Jerusalem wasn't even in this location. It was southeast of here. The real Old City where Jerusalem was formerly built was called the City of David, and it was south of the Temple Mount. Here is a view from the Mount of Olivet of what is left of that city today. It is a total desolation. Nevertheless, when people visit Jerusalem today, they begin to fashion mental images of what they assume Jerusalem looked like in the 1st century when Jesus walked here. And from all these sights and sounds, the imaginations run wild trying to visualize what it was like way back then. When Rome conquered the Jewish Hasmonean kingdom in around 50 BC, Herod the Great was installed as king over the Jews. Herod was loyal to Rome and a great builder. He modeled his city, Jerusalem, after the city of Rome. Jerusalem became a fabulous city, not at all like what you see today. Herod built glorious buildings. Here we see a theater he created for the arts. As a lover of sports, he built the Hippodrome, which was a racetrack and also doubled for sporting events. He built for himself a spectacular palace, and in addition to the Antonia Fortress north of the city, he built an additional fortress on the west side of town with 3 towers to watch over and protect the western flank of the city. In addition to these structures, as the city sprawled westward, King David's tomb was moved from the southeast ridge and placed on the western hill. And so also could be found the house of the high Jewish priest Caiaphas, as well as the Jewish palace of the Hasmoneans. Numerous and immaculate homes of wealthy Jews were also built on this western side of the city. And not to be forgotten, Herod the Great Builder also built the fabulous Jewish temple. But where? Where did he build it? Jerusalem was a modern city with fabulous buildings and looked nothing like what you can imagine today. But when Titus the Roman general destroyed the temple, he also destroyed all of these wonderful buildings. Not one stone was left upon another. Its stunning magnificence overwhelmed the simple fishermen who followed Jesus to the big city. And this was why they were shocked when he predicted that the entire city would be destroyed and not one stone would be left standing upon another. Not only were the beautiful buildings destroyed, but the temple itself, the centerpiece of Judaism, as well. But this is exactly what happened. Jerusalem was destroyed even to the foundations. Nothing was left. After all the archaeological digs that have taken place in Jerusalem, not even one has unearthed any remnant of any foundation of any building from the 1st century. It was gone. It became just as Jesus said it would become. Not one stone left standing upon another. But there's a problem with the words of Jesus' prophecy, because there are many stones left in the walls that you see behind me that date back to the time of Herod. They are still standing one upon another. In fact, close to 10,000 of them. So either Jesus in his prediction wasn't being precise in his facts, or there is something else we just do not or cannot understand. David Seeloff is a historian, archaeologist, and theologian. But most importantly, he was a close associate and colleague of the late Dr. Ernest Martin, whose remarkable and unprecedented historical research has led to the production of this amazing story. David joins us now, bringing his wealth of historical and archaeological insight in helping to solve the riddle of the lost and forgotten temples of the Jews. Hey, David. Hey, man, thanks for coming to Jerusalem to help us with this. I really appreciate it. I wanted to start here because this is the one of the outstanding points of modern-day biblical eschatology, prophecy. And all the scholars say that Jesus is going to walk from that Mount of Olivet behind us through the Kidron Valley, and he's going to come through this sealed-up gate. And then he's going to go through the gate to the temple on the other side, and he will have returned to the earth and set up his messianic kingdom. And that's, of course, a common prophecy, and I've been hearing that for 40 or 50 years. In fact, I think the Arabs might have believed it somewhat because they built a cemetery here so that they would try to keep Jesus from doing that because no high priest would walk across any dead bodies. So they even bought into the idea that there is a prophecy. But there is something in the Bible written about a sealed eastern gate. So you could actually use that scripture to substantiate that this is the eastern gate. And so what do you have to say about that?
Well, if this was the temple, and it was not. So that whole theory goes out the window, because this was not the temple. This was Fortress Antonia.
When Jesus prophesied up there on the Mount of Olivet, he said, when this city is going to be torn down, every stone, even down to the foundations, will be torn up. There'll be nothing left of the city. And that has presented a tremendous problem that has, to this day, I don't think been reconciled, because we can't find any remains of the old city on the western side, and we can't find any remains of the temple. And yet, here we have this amazing wall that circles the city that still has Herodian stones in it.
Right.
How do you reconcile what he said to the fact that there still remains stuff from the first century in this wall?
Well, you cannot reconcile it if you think that this is the temple. I mean, you can see the Herodian stones right here in front of our eyes in the lower portions, not excluding the gate, but to this side and this side. And if this is the temple, then Jesus' prophecy is not true. But nobody ever called Jesus out and said, well, his prophecies are not true because there's many stones upon another. So even back then, at the time of the New Testament period, after Christ was crucified, resurrected, and ascended, nobody ever attacked the Christians on that basis. Not one. As a matter of fact, nobody through history has ever attacked him on that point, that the prophecy did not take place. So it's interesting that this whole scenario is based on the fact that this erroneous prophetic scenario is based on the fact that this was the Temple Mount, and it was not. It was a third of a mile south of the southern wall of this massive, massive structure.
So a lot of things that were spoken in the Bible have been assigned to certain places, certain venues, and those venues do not necessitate that those were the actual venues. And this is another example of that.
Yes, tradition, once again, trumps eyewitness and historical records.
So tradition is the enemy of truth.
Absolutely.
Okay, I want to go up to the Lion's Gate, and I want to talk to you more about the Antonia Fortress because it's a particular problem I'm having. So
okay.
let's go on up to the Lion's Gate. Well, David, so much of the research done by Dr. Martin, who was the inspiration for this film, came from the writings of Flavius Josephus and yourself. You've done a lot of research on Flavius Josephus, but a lot of people don't know who Flavius Josephus was. Why don't you tell us something about Josephus so we can get a better insight into who he was in history?
Josephus was a Jewish historian who wrote his works in the late 1st century, in the 90s. And he was a Jewish general originally. He grew up, he was from a Jewish family from the Levitical stock, the tribe of Levi, and he was actually from a priestly family. So he could have served in the temple. He went to Galilee and was put in charge, in command of the forces, the Jewish forces up in the north. Josephus' troops were defeated and Josephus was taken prisoner. Josephus then turned sides and worked for the Romans, helping them to try and get the Jews to surrender in Jerusalem.
He was captured, and then the Romans gave him all of their historical records, and he wrote some tremendous work.
He was so useful to the Romans that they gave him the court records of King Herod the Great. And they also gave Josephus the temple books that were contained in the holy place by the priests.
Out of all the historical records that he was given by the Romans, he wrote some amazing and outstanding works that are used today by many people in trying to understand and study the 1st century. I think the history of the Jews is one, and then the wars of the Jews is the other. So he was a great historian.
Herodotus, who is known in general as the father of history, was not an eyewitness to the events that he wrote about, whereas Josephus, particularly in his book, The Wars of the Jews, he was there.
And a lot of people to this day accuse him of being an exaggerator, and his works aren't to be taken seriously. But I think as we see the facts that are presented in this presentation, we're going to find that Josephus was the real deal, and that what he had to say in the past is valid evidence and proof of what really happened in the 1st century.
When he's describing the dimensions of this structure or that structure, he was there. He lived there. He was there at the destruction and even after the destruction. So we have to account and give him credit for what he saw and what he reported, because he was on the scene.
When people seek to look backward in time, there is a common lens available to look backward through, and millions upon millions of people have used it. The time lens is located at the Israeli Museum. The lens is a miniature rendering of the city of Jerusalem in the 1st century. The model came from the creative mind of the late Avi Yonah, and in 1973, it was his view of 1st century Jerusalem and what it looked like then. Today, it remains the world's most authoritative representation of how Jerusalem and the temple looked in those days. But is it accurate? To date, no one has ever questioned its accuracy, nor its authenticity. Take a close look at the size, location, and design of the Antonia fortress. Compared to the temple area, the fortress of Antonia is very small. While Avi Yonah claims he derived his model's design from the writings of Flavius Josephus, on closer examination of the writings of Josephus, we will find enormous discrepancies between Avi's model and the actual writings of the eyewitness account of Flavius Josephus. When Josephus talked about the Antonia fortress, he said when you approached from the north, which is what we're doing now, this is the northern wall of the Harem, or the Temple Mount. He said that the Antonia fortress was so big that it even obstructed your view of the temple. If the Antonia fortress was to the west and as small as Avi Yonah created it to be, then it doesn't fit the message of Flavius Josephus. You could not see the temple from this direction as you approach the north wall.
Now as to the fortress Antonia, the inward parts have the largeness and form of a palace, it being parted into all kinds of rooms, and other conveniences such as courts, and places for bathing, and broad spaces for camps. Insomuch that by having all the conveniences that cities wanted, it might seem to be composed of several cities, but by its magnificence it seemed a palace. Flavius Josephus, Wars of the Jews.
A stream of Muslim people are getting ready to go up on top of the harem. So we're going to go through this Lion's Gate, which feeds on to the Via della Rosa, which I think means the way of grief, and it's according to the Greeks. David, one of the things that grieves me to my bones is how they have displayed this Temple Mount model along with the Antonia fortress. And this Iona guy that claims that he used Flavius Josephus' statements and specifications wherewith to design his model. Kind of a cool tractor. But I've read Flavius Josephus' explanation for the Antonia fortress specifically, and what he says is not anywhere close to way the model that Iona designed looked. I think the first thing that comes to my mind concerning his the size of his Antonia, Iona's Antonia, is that it's really small.
Yes.
It just doesn't look like it could contain the numerous troops of the 10th Legion.
Josephus says that it contained, Antonia was able to contain a tagma, a legion of troops. And it's interesting that even the English translations change that word from legion, where it is everywhere else in Josephus, and they change it to cohort, which has no relationship to the original Greek term. So it's just amazing. It's not just the descriptors, those who describe graphically or through modeling Fortress Antonia, but also those who do the translations.
And not only that, it's everybody. It seems
Yes.
like it's in all his model is in all the encyclopedias, all the religious literature. It's kind of like the lens even the layman uses to look back into the first century, but that lens is flawed.
Josephus said that it was larger and more massive than the temple, and this meant the entire expanse of
Well,
the
it wasn't.
Antonia.
It's 35 acres up there.
Yeah.
Wasn't that the size of the average Roman fort? About 35. 30?
Of the time that Herod built it, yes.
All the forts were modeled after a certain template,
Correct.
and the Antonia fortress was. Even though it was trapezoidal, most of the fortresses were rectangular, and this is a little bit off, but it still was basically, in terms of acreage, the same size.
Right. Herod made accommodation for the geology of the area, which is normal.
Yeah.
And he wasn't specifically a Roman, but we can be assured that he used the best Roman architects and the best Roman construction methods to build this massive, massive structure, much larger than the temple.
Well, there's other things I want to talk about that Iona missed as well, and I think the minute you look at that model, the first thing you notice, apart from the size, is the towers. All those towers are uniform.
On Aviona's model, yes.
Now, as to the Fortress Antonia, the entire structure resembled that of a tower. It also contained 4 other distinct towers at its 4 corners, whereof the others were but 50 cubits high. That which lay upon the southeast corner was 70 cubits, that from thence the whole temple might be viewed. Flavius Josephus, Wars of the Jews.
But according to Josephus, the southeast tower was measurably much taller.
Yeah, 1/3 taller than the other.
And that was because they had to use that tower to look into the Jewish temple to make sure the Jews weren't doing anything, hanky-panky.
And if you had a correct perspective of the relationship from Antonia to the temple, you could see, indeed, you could look into the temple from that perspective, but not from Abba Yonah's model. It's impossible.
The Antonia fortress was home to over 6,000 troops of the 10th Legion, so Jonah's depiction of Antonia was far too small to contain such a great number of men. But Jonah made another curious miscalculation in his design. The fortress Antonia in Jonah's model is noticeably offset and extends outward from the western wall, and this again is not consistent with Josephus' eyewitness account. And while this is an almost unnoticeably small issue, the insight into why Jonah designed it this way uncovers a colossal insight as to why the location for the Jewish temple today remains so uncertain, elusive, and misplaced. What caused Jonah to ignore Flavius Josephus' eyewitness account? Every Friday afternoon, pilgrims from many Christian backgrounds gather at the Via Dolorosa, or the Way of Grief. The famous road is at the northeastern part of the old city of Jerusalem. The ancient roadway was originally built by Hadrian in the 2nd century, and it was at this time Hadrian also placed paving stones in the area as well. But it was only from the time of the 12th century, 1,000 years later, that it became known as the Via Dolorosa by the Franciscan monks, who deemed it to be the very way Jesus traveled on his way to being crucified. The route ends conveniently at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Along this Via Dolorosa, there are different stopping points called Stations of the Cross. One of the first stations along the Via Dolorosa is called the Station of Flagellations or Whippings, a holy gathering place for Christians. But what does this have to do with the A.V. Jonah model and the Antonia fortress being offset to the west? Jesus was beaten and whipped on the pavement of the Antonia fortress. This pavement, it was thought by the Franciscan monks, was the very site where Jesus was whipped and beaten. It was concluded that this therefore must have been the site of the Antonia fortress. Yet it was the pavement stones laid down by Hadrian at the same time he built the road. But in the 12th century, the Franciscan monks prevailed on the Crusaders to erect this building, which has remained for 800 years. Notice how it is in the exact location of Jonah's model today, on the northwest corner. As we see it from a northern point of view, it reveals that the building is overlapping the line and extending outward from the western wall, the same as in Jonah's model. But Josephus indicated the fortress was flush with the western wall. Yet this pavement, claimed to be the floor of the Antonia fortress, extends west of the line of the western wall, contrary to the description of Josephus. Just as Christians, Jonah accepted the pavement stones as the actual site of the Antonia fortress. Thus he had to place the Antonia fortress in his model offset to the west in order to cover the paving stones of Hadrian and thus accommodate what he considered historical fact. But this was not the pavement nor the site of the Antonia fortress. This pavement was laid down by Hadrian 100 years after the death of Jesus. The bias of Jonah's model and the ongoing commemoration by the Christians every Friday afternoon perpetuate the view that the Antonia fortress was a diminutive little appendage northwest and offset of the so-called Temple Mount, when in fact the Antonia fortress sat on a massive 35-acre parcel of land that housed the entire 10th Legion of over 6,000 men and hundreds more who supported them and did so for some 300 years up until Constantine. This enormous mistake has clouded the truth and kept the Jewish people from locating the proper site for their temple. As we shall see, by not listening to Flavius Josephus, Aviona made other significant mistakes in his first century model.
Okay, so what you can see, Ken, is that what Aviona presents as, I used Josephus as my model, as my guide to developing my model, rather. That's not the case. He's very selective in choosing what he accepts and what he doesn't, because they feel that what they see today is not what Josephus was talking about, and they go with their eyes rather than what the eyewitness says.
Amazing.
Flavius Josephus, in his Wars of the Jews, makes specific reference to a significant feature of the Herodian temple complex that was totally ignored in the Aviona model.
Now, as to the Fortress Antonia, it was situated at the corner of two cloisters of the court of the temple, of that on the west and that of the north. Flavius Josephus.
Before the final destruction of the temple, Titus stood at the southern wall of the Antonia fortress and directed the final battle between the Romans and the Jews, which, according to Josephus, was waged upon two arms or colonnades. These two colonnades stretched 600 feet and connected the temple and the Antonia fortress. Yet, these two colonnades, so vividly discussed by Josephus, do not appear in the Iona model.
And so I want to talk to you about this statement that Flavius Josephus made about the two arms that connected the Antonia fortress with the temple, because only in Dr. Ernest Martin's discoveries do I find any information about this. It seems like it's a big missing link, and so I'd like you to help us understand what Josephus said about it, but talk to us about what Flavius Josephus said and how significant it is in the design problem of the Aviona model as opposed to Dr. Ernest Martin's model.
Well, Dr. Ernest Martin's model just read Josephus normally, as a normal reader would read it, that there were two arms, two colonnades, which were like limbs that went from Fortress Antonia to the temple. And the reason Josephus keys on this is because it was a major factor in conquering the temple area. And Josephus says that a major battle took place on those two colonnades, back and forth, and that the warriors were pushing. When you fight with a shield and a sword and a helmet on your head, and people behind you, you have two groups that are pushing against each other, back and forth, and Josephus describes that wave back and forth of the two combatant groups fighting for control of this, what we would call a bridge, and what Josephus called colonnades. And this was a major turning point where, the Romans were not able to get control of the bridge and entrance to the temple, and therefore they had to find a different way in.
Why do you suppose that other scholars haven't understood these two arms? Maybe it's because it's called two arms, and without understanding the battle, you wouldn't see how much Josephus emphasized it. Maybe, do you think that's the reason why it hasn't come out?
Well, that whole description that Josephus says makes no sense if you think that the temple was here, instead of where it actually was, farther south, and that this was Fortress Antonia.
So people's biases would blind them to understanding the arms, and had not Josephus gone in length discussing the battle, and it must have been, Titus must have been up on that wall up there, right up there, looking down at the battle on the two arms, and it's, because I recall reading it myself, that Titus actually watched that battle take place that emphasized the two arms that connected the Antonia fortress with the temple.
Yeah, the description that Josephus gives is actually like a script description of what was going on, blow by blow, even getting down to individuals who were fighting in that particular battle and naming them. This is not something you would just make up. And yes, Titus was directing the battle, directing the flow of this battle with hundreds of men on both sides in this narrow, two narrow spaces connecting the Antonia to the temple.
And Herod would have wanted that connection because he would want to have access. Those colonnades were built so that his troops could get to the temple area right away.
Yes.
And quell any kind of disturbance by the Jews, because they were a pretty rowdy bunch in those days.
Yeah, Josephus says they were rioting all the time, and for security reasons, you wanted to have access to the temple from the fortress immediately without having to go through masses of people to quell the riot or the disturbance that would be occurring in the temple.
So the Antonia model, the Antonia temple model that we see in the Israeli museum today, doesn't even come close. There's no connection of those two arms or those two colonnades at all. It's not connected at all. You don't see any connection. But he goes on to say, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that those two colonnades connected on the northwest corner
Of the temple.
To
Antonia.
To Antonia. But there's no reference to those colonnades in that model. There's nothing. It's totally void. So, but that model is a major looking glass that people use to try to understand the first century Antonia and the temple. Let's take another look over here so that we have a great reference point. That southwest corner is probably where the beginning of those colonnades stretched down towards the city of David to the south.
Right.
And of course they're gone today because that would have been part of the temple complex that was destroyed by the Roman invasion of Titus in 70 AD. It's totally gone now.
Now as to the fortress Antonia, it was erected upon a rock of 50 cubits in height and was on a great precipice. Flavius Josephus, Wars of the Jews.
Hey David, as you know, I have a lot of problems with positioning the Fortress Antonia over this area where that pavement is that Hadrian laid down. And this is a big one to me, and that is that Josephus said that the Antonia fortress was built over a rock that was 75 feet high.
Right.
I don't know about you, but I don't see that rock anywhere in sight.
Well, nobody's ever found it. Nobody's ever said where it could be or is, and nobody's ever identified it through history, in spite of what Josephus says. So they just ignore it.
But how do you ignore a 75-foot rock?
Okay, so we've come to this place where is this Church of the Ecce Homo. As you can see the doorway over here. They have this thing that says lithostratos, which means the pavement.
Right.
And again, this is part of the area that was adopted by A.V. Yonah when he built his Antonia fortress model, accommodated the idea of this being the spot where Jesus was whipped, and you can see it in his model. But again, there's no stone here that's 75 feet high. Where is it? Is it underneath this thing? How could it be 75 feet high? It would have to be flat to build this on top of. There's no rock according to the way Josephus described it in his writings. Nothing. There's nothing.
Nothing here.
And that's a major part of the whole story about the Antonia, because he said, Josephus said, it was built over a rock 75 feet high. That's pretty, I think you could call that prodigious. But there's nothing. But I gotta tell you something, I think I know where the rock is.
Okay.
Come on.
Josephus described in Wars of the Jews a 75-foot rock upon which the Antonia fortress was built. To date, no one knows where that rock was or is. Could this formation be the rock Josephus described? In Book 5, Chapter 4 of Flavius Josephus' War of the Jews, he stated concerning Jerusalem,
The city of Jerusalem was built upon two hills which are opposite to one another and have a valley to divide them asunder. Of these hills, the which contains the upper city is much higher in length and more direct. Accordingly, it was called the Citadel by King David, but by us it is called the Upper Marketplace. Now the valley of the cheesemongers is that valley which distinguished the hill of the upper city from that of the lower. Over against this was a third hill, but naturally lower than the Acra. Flavius Josephus, Wars of the Jews.
Could this third missing hill have any connection to the 75-foot rock that Josephus said the Antonia fortress was built over? We have a missing third hill and a missing 75-foot rock.
How could this be? Just north of the Wailing Wall, there exist the Kotel tunnels. These tunnels are about 40 feet below the ground surface and run along the northwest side of the western wall. The tunnels take us down to the foundation blocks of the so-called Temple Mount. Either the builders of the wall had to dig deep down to set the blocks in place, or these blocks were originally set at the actual ground level. It is important to note this because the rocks tell a story. On careful inspection of these massive foundation stones, it is evident that the blocks were designed and placed in a specific way. Each layer of stone is recessed 1 inch back from the stone below it. This cantilever design actually causes the wall, as it rises, to lean into the hill behind it. But why build a wall to lean into a hill?
If you notice, this is that big rock, and this is the one below it. But notice it's set back, we've been told, 3 centimeters. So if you keep doing that, the next one is back 3 centimeters. This means that this wall is cantilevered in. And why would they do that? And the answer is because they put fill dirt behind it, and that's the way they were able to bring more stability to the earth that was brought in, that leveled off the whole Temple Mount, or the harem.
For what purpose? Why would a hill need to be restrained? The answer to this riddle will become more evident as we continue northward along the western wall in the Kotel tunnels. As we continue to walk the tunnel along the northwestern wall, we come to a massive rock formation.
I want to say something here about this rock. This is probably part of the rock that Josephus was talking about that ended up coming to an apex. So the whole area of the Antonia was over this rock, I think. And part of the reason that the Antonia area, or what they call the Temple Mount area, is trapezoidal is they did the best they could to put those walls with the contour of this rock without having to. Can you imagine what it would have taken to cut down through this rock to make it absolutely rectangular? It would have been too much of a chore. This is that rock.
In a general survey of the land surrounding Jerusalem, there is not one other plateau like the Temple Mount precinct. The entire topography of the area surrounding Jerusalem exists of rocky mountains with crags and deep valleys. The fact that the Temple Mount area was of the same character is supported by surveys conducted by Charles Warren in the 1850s. His work conclusively proved that the substrate of the Temple Mount was of varying heights and not nearly flat at all. Thus, it would require fill dirt to make it level, especially if one desired to build a fortress up there. The fact of the matter is, the so-called Temple Mount was actually 75 feet lower than today. The renowned area originally was lower in elevation than the 2 hills that sustain Jerusalem, and astonishingly corresponds to Josephus' third hill. When this third hill was built up with fill dirt, it became higher than the location of Acre, or the city of David. The current Temple Mount is not the authentic Temple Mount area, but rather the location of the third hill, originally a rock formation, the apex of which reached a point 75 feet above the block foundation. As more and more fill dirt was brought in, the level of the ground rose and covered the entire 35 acres with hundreds of tons of fill dirt until all that was left showing of the rock was its apex, which today is underneath the dome of the rock. Thus, the true site of the temple remains unknown to the world, and those seeking to locate its rightful place are completely lost, led astray by erroneous conclusions.
But when all the true historic facts are unearthed, collected, and pieced together, the body of the gathered evidence paints an entirely different picture than that which is presented in the widely accepted A.V. Yonah model. The truth is, these forensics prove that the so-called Temple Mount area was in actuality the site of Herod's massive Antonia fortress.
But the lost and hidden rock, over which Herod's Antonia fortress was built, pales in comparison to a more outstanding rock, a rock which has its own remarkable story. After their temple and city were completely demolished, some 900 Jews, men, women, and children, fled to Herod's Masada Rock fortress, where they held out for 3 years, awaiting their fate.
David, we've come to Masada, which is a famous place in history. It's the place where 900 Jewish people that fled from the Romans from the 70 AD war and held out here for 3 years, from 70 to around 73. But the reason we've come here is because of the records that Josephus gives us about some survivors.
The people that were up here actually fled from Jerusalem before or during the final attack, and they literally escaped in fear of their lives and then went down to the Dead Sea and then came up here and were able to overpower the few Roman guards that were here. And at the end of the siege, they voted to commit suicide rather than to be captured by the Romans after a very difficult and long siege. And the people who were commanded and instructed to each one, they would draw lots. And the first one would then kill the one with the losing lot, and then they would draw another set of lots and so on down the line till the last one would kill the last people. Well, there were 5 survivors, women and children, I think 2 adults at least, and 3 children that survived. And they relate that Eleazar gave a speech talking about how we've lost everything, including the temple, including our city, Jerusalem, and that the only thing that remains in the city of Jerusalem is the camp of those who destroyed it. The Roman fortress, the Roman camp that was originally designed by King Herod to Roman specifications and was not considered part of the city to fulfill Jesus' prophecy.
With the final defeat of the Jews at the rock fortress Masada, the Roman 10th Legion returned to the only remaining structure left intact after the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, Herod's enormous Antonia fortress. But the events that took place at Masada would live on as legend, becoming a sacred stronghold and symbol of Jewish resistance against persecution. But while Masada looms large as a high place, both literally and metaphorically in the Jewish consciousness, the rubble and debris from their disastrous past has covered over and hidden from view a much more significant and salient event which has been lost.
It was an event that was so monumental that it completely altered the course of Jewish life and history, and it makes the events that took place at Masada pale in comparison. But to this day, it remains virtually unknown to the world. And yet, the event has severely hindered the discovery for the rightful place of the Jewish temple,
the very center and core of Jewish identity. But it wasn't until 1880 that the accumulation of the dust of time began to be swept and cleared away as the veil lifted for all the world to see. It all began with the discovery of Hezekiah's tunnel. 2 young lads inadvertently stumbled into a cave that led to the waterway of Hezekiah's tunnel. It was built in 700 BC by King Hezekiah to thwart the Assyrian advance by rechanneling the water of the Gihon spring from outside to inside through his tunnel. But the importance of the discovery of the tunnel is that it precisely pointed to the exact location of the city of David. It was clearly not on the southwest hill as all had thought, but David's city was rather on the southeast ridge. Hezekiah's tunnel made this fact undeniably clear.
This ancient water system, Hezekiah's tunnel, is a very, very important archaeological discovery. And it happened about 150 years ago because even though the tunnel was built in the 8th century BC, it was lost people didn't even know it existed until two young boys stumbled in to the tunnel system and rediscovered Hezekiah's tunnel. That had an amazing impact on scholars because they had thought the city of David was on the western hill. But lo and behold, with the discovery of Hezekiah's tunnel, their whole view had to change because this was prima facie evidence that yes, this must be where the city of David was located, at least above this tunnel, because we're underneath the ground for, I don't know, probably 100 feet or so from the city upwards of David. And so with that discovery, the whole world of scholarship began to change, the thinking changed, and this tunnel is prima facie evidence of where the exact location of the city of David was and is today.
The discovery of Hezekiah's tunnel must not be glossed over, but it must be underscored many times because it clearly pinpoints the location of the city of David, which was synonymous with the Jewish temple and Mount Zion. But where is Mount Zion today? No one knows. But now we come to the historic event that overshadows the enormity of the legend of Masada.
Well, David, you know, when I was a little kid coming from a Jewish family, we celebrated Hanukkah. That was what was offered to us as opposed to Christmas. And my family didn't know very much about Jewish history. In fact, only my Uncle Harry told me about Judah Maccabee liberating the Jewish temple. And so there's a lot of history that I never was privy to, never heard anything about it. But one of the great things I've learned from you is south of here, there was a great mountain. It was probably 200 feet higher than what we see down there. It was called Mount Zion, and it had a lot to do with what happened after the Jewish temple was liberated. David, would you please tell us what you know about Mount Zion? Because it was a big deal in Jewish history and had a great deal to do with the location of the Jewish temple.
Yes, Mount Zion was very close to the temple, and it was discussed all through the Old Testament, through the entire Old Testament. Mount Zion is mentioned time after time. Mount Zion was desecrated by the Greeks during the time of Judas Maccabeus, and his brother, when he took power as king and high priest,
Simon the
Hasmonean, he decided that the only way to cleanse this was to completely rip down the mountain, rip down Mount Zion, remove all the loose earth, and cut it down to bedrock, and then even cut a little bit further, just enough to make it completely clean area, and then to rebuild the temple.
Now, the amputation of Mount Zion is virtually unknown to the world, but somehow you've come into the knowledge of this, or Dr. Martin did, and put it in his book. How do we know that this is a fact of history?
Dr. Martin developed this material as he was working through the location of the temple through Josephus, and that led him to re-examine Maccabees. And then he saw that there was a combining of the two to, as I said, the coherent story of what happened when, and the approval of everybody except the Essenes. And some of the writings of the Essenes also bear into the evidence that he developed.
Well, you can't just take a mountain and it disappear. Where did all the material of the mountain go?
Well, the material of the mountain was thrown into the Kidron Valley and on the other side in the Tyropoeon Valley. And these two valleys were then filled up while the mountaintop was literally shaved.
However, in those days when the Hasmoneans reigned, they filled up that valley with earth and had a mind to join the upper city with the temple. Then they took off part of the height of the Acra and reduced it to be of less elevation than before, that the temple might be superior to it. Flavius Josephus, Wars of the Jews.
You can still see even more evidence of how Mount Zion was removed by Simon. The entire southern portion of the southeast ridge was terraced downward, like stairs leading to what was left of the southern tip. Both First Maccabees and Flavius Josephus record how Simon the Hasmonean cut down and removed Mount Zion. In his grand scheme, he accomplished two things. No longer would foreign powers such as Syria be tempted to invade and seize the high ground of Mount Zion and David's citadel. Both had been removed. But the mountain itself would be used to fill up the valley of the cheesemongers to the west, thus connecting the southeast ridge with the western hill. Jerusalem would expand and grow westward. But with the excavated remains of Mount Zion having filled the Trophonian, or Valley of the Cheesemongers, and Mount Zion having vanished from sight and from history, the name of Mount Zion was transferred to the Western Hill, and the Western Hill became known as Mount Zion itself, and so it is to this very day.
This Zion Gate really has no relationship to Mount Zion at all. Simon had chopped down Mount Zion, cut it down completely to the bedrock, and that completely changed the geology of the entire area. And so that this has no relationship to Mount Zion. Mount Zion was over there, not here, but when Mount Zion was cut down, the city expanded to the west, and that became encircled. This may be a legitimate gate, but it's not the southwestern gate of Jerusalem. It might be the northwestern gate of Jerusalem.
Well, you can see the Wailing Wall off in the distance, and I want to give you kind of a perspective on this Trophonian Valley, or the Valley of the Cheesemongers. It kind of came down this road, and you can see kind of how it's ramped down. This is still all fill dirt here, and it went down, 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 down through this dung gate here, which of course the valley was wider, but this just gives you a perspective on where this Trophonian Valley went. We're going to go down a little farther, and there's a road right down there where you see that truck going down. That's how that Trophonian Valley fell down to the west side of the city of David. So the Trophonian Valley went southward this way. The city of David's over here, and it was pretty deep. It was as deep, most likely, as the Kidron Valley. But this valley went down this way, and you can see how this street falls off here, and this is where the Trophonian Valley went. The city of David's off to my left here, but you can see how it fell off. This is all fill dirt. It came from the Mount Zion that Simon cut down and filled in this area connecting the western side. There's the western hill over there, and the southeast ridge is over here. But this is the route that the Trophonian Valley went, and then it kind of circled to the left and then connected in with the Kidron Valley south of the city of David. Now, as you look off to my right here, the city of David was over this way, and it was much higher. That's the hard part, because most people, they don't give it much thought, because the whole city was cut down by Simon. He lowered the Ophel, and he totally cut down Mount Zion, and it's gone. There was a mountain down there, but it's no more. And that's why it's so hard to understand the topography of Jerusalem unless you understand the history and the writings and what has been witnessed in history by other people that came to this area. But that's the area of the city of David. That's where the temple was, down in that area. And so we're going to go to another perspective. And so it's really hard to visualize what Jerusalem was like today, 3,000 years later.
Right, and it's a geological problem, because you have to reconceive of what the geology, all you have are the historical sources. But unless you go to the historical sources and read Maccabees, you don't have a clue as to what it was like back then.
No wonder it's so hard to figure out where the temple goes, because unless you know through the writings that there was a mountain down here, you have no idea what Jerusalem looked like or where the temple went. And so people think that it was up there on the Harem, or what they call today the Temple Mount.
Right. That area was not the highest point in Jerusalem in the time of Simon the Hasmonean.
That's right, because Josephus said there was a third hill.
Yes.
And it was lower than these two hills down here, the western Jerusalem and the southeast ridge that we're looking at. Wow, amazing.
Simon's activity was so radical that it is difficult for people to actually believe that it took place, except it's presented in a matter-of-fact manner. And it's presented as if, well, of course, and he had all the approval of the people. Now, what Dr. Martin gets into a little bit in his book was that the only people who objected to Simon doing this were the Essenes. And apparently they objected very strongly and called Simon the wicked priest.
We need to go to Qumran, because that's where they went to escape what they thought was an untenable situation here in Jerusalem. So let's go on over to Qumran and see where these people lived and where they fled to escape the evil king priest.
This is Qumran, the site of the Hermetic wilderness residence of the Orthodox sect of the Essenes. The sect had formerly resided in the city of David when Simon the Hasmonean was given unilateral authority to act as both king and priest. But what is the connection, the hidden connection, between the Essenes, Mount Zion, and the location of the Jewish temple? The fact of the matter is that the Essenes hated Simon the Hasmonean. They so disdained his decision to cut down Mount Zion and then to move the tomb of King David to the western hill that in protest they left Jerusalem for Qumran, building their headquarters here by the Dead Sea. Their famous Dead Sea Scrolls were written here, and the temple scroll found in one of these caves testifies of their contempt for Simon when they named him the evil priest king. The Essenes story is a major forensic evidence in that it resurrects the memory of Mount Zion before Simon tore it down from the southeast ridge. The reality of its former existence is absolutely critical in determining the exact and precise location of the Jewish temples.
When you look at the Wailing Wall, it's easy to forget that the Wailing Wall that you see is only about 60 feet tall, but actually in total it's 109 feet. So what you see is only about maybe 60% of the entire height of the wall. A lot of it is under the ground, which means this place was a lot deeper in the first century. Unless you understand the topography of Jerusalem, you can really get faked out in trying to figure out where the Jewish temple of the Jews really stood. This area was filled in by dirt, by Simon when he cut down Mount Zion. He took the dirt from Mount Zion and used it to fill in this Valley of the Cheesemonger, which was also called the Trophonian Valley. And so it's been leveled out. And unless you understand how the lay of the land was, it's really hard to come to grips with where the Jewish temple really stood. But if you were up on top, you would see that the Temple Mount area, or the Harem, was trapezoidal. And so it kind of filtered down into a much tighter width when you get down to the city of David. In fact, it goes all the way down to the southern area of the city of David and almost forms a triangle. So this brings to mind something one of my friends, Michael Sanders, said to me when he said, you know, don't forget what Josephus said about the temple.
I have lots of stories. I've had an incredible life, right? I was the Forrest Gump in reality, you know. I've had the most wonderful of lives, tremendous background, had a lot of adventures, and none of it is valid. Either what I say is right or it's wrong. You see, the Wailing Wall and the Western Wall, there's always a controversy of somebody not liking it being called the Wailing Wall and people calling it the Western Wall. Many Jews believe that this is part of the temple itself. When they're pressed on it, when the archaeologists start talking, then, well, maybe it's the outer wall of the temple. The problem with all that, where it is that Josephus was very explicit, and he was there, about the dimensions of the temple and the dimensions of where the Haram now is. Josephus said quite clearly that the southern promenade of the temple was 600 feet long. Fair enough. But then he said, and it goes from valley to valley. And it couldn't be extended anymore because the valleys were there. The problem is that in the Haram, it's 900 feet. So you put a 600 feet structure on the Haram, it certainly doesn't go from valley to valley, and you could extend it another 300 feet. So either Josephus was lying, and what's the point of him lying, or it's in the wrong place. By chance, if you look at the drawing of the temple on my website, you will see that the city of David, from valley to valley, is exactly 600 feet. It's not a foot more, and it's not a foot less. It happens to be the exact same size as Josephus described as the southern promenade of the temple. 600 feet, the width of the city of David from valley to valley, the Cheesemonger Valley to the Kidron Valley is 600 feet. At that point, just above where? The Gihon Spring, where you would expect it to be. Not further north of the Gihon Spring, not south of the Gihon Spring, exactly where the Gihon Spring is. That's where the temple was. That's where you would build a temple. That's where I would build a temple. That's where David and Solomon built a temple.
So this area was too big, but it wasn't too big for the 10th Legion. There were 6,000 men in the 10th Legion, and this 35-acre harem could have easily accommodated those men, as well as the 3,000 to 4,000 other people that had to support that 10th Legion. When you study the topography, you get a real sense of where the temple only could go and where it couldn't go. And for sure, because this harem is 900 feet across, it didn't go up here, it went south over the city of David.
I'm a hydrogeologist, work for the U.S. Geological Survey. My specialty is underground water, and I've studied groundwater systems all over the United States and all over the world. And I found one of the fascinating places that I've looked into groundwater is actually in Jerusalem at the Gihon Spring. And the Gihon Spring is very fascinating because it's a spring in a karst system, and there are thousands of karst springs all over the world. But the Gihon Spring is an unusual type of spring, a very rare type of karst spring that we often call a siphon spring. And there's probably only maybe a dozen or so of these springs all over the world, and the Gihon Spring is one of them. And so how these siphon springs operate is that somewhere uphill of the spring there'll be a cavern, and this cavern naturally slowly replenishes as groundwater fills the cavern. But connecting the cavern and the spring, there'll be a channel, and the channel won't be straight, otherwise as the water naturally filled the cavern, it would just continually flow out of the spring. But what happens in these rare siphon springs is this channel will be in the shape of an upside down U. So there'll be a high point. So as that cavern starts to fill naturally with water, with groundwater, very slowly, there's nowhere for it to run out. And as the cavern fills, that channel fills, until the cavern reaches, the water level in the cavern reaches the high point on that upside down U. And once that happens, then the water starts to flow and it creates a siphon effect. So it's just like if you siphon gasoline out of your gas tank, and you've got a hose that's coming out of your gas tank, and once you get that gasoline flowing, as long as the end of that hose is below that water level, that gasoline is going to continue to come out of your tank until that level comes below the end of your hose, and then the air will get in and stop. So the same thing happens naturally underground in a siphon spring. That cavern will start to empty until either the water level in the cavern reaches the level of the spring, or the water level completely drains the cavern and air can enter that channel either from the cavern or from the spring. And once that happens, the siphon is broken and the flow stops. So when the flow is flowing very strongly from the spring, that's when the cavern is emptying. And then when the siphon breaks, then the flow rate slows back down to a trickle. So the question some people ask is, could the water level have naturally gotten up to the level of the temple? And the answer to that question is, it depends on where the water level is in the cavern relative to the elevation at the temple. So we know from the fact that this is a siphon spring that there in fact was somewhere uphill a cavern that was filling with water. Now if the Gihon spring was not a siphon spring, we wouldn't know that. The water level could simply be only a few feet above the spring somewhere, but because it's a siphon spring, we know there's a cavern somewhere uphill, probably at some substantial elevation above the spring. So if I wanted to have that water come all the way up to the temple, it's sort of like I want in my gas tank, my hose, I want the gasoline to come out higher. You'd simply raise the hose up higher to get the gasoline to come out of your hose higher. But you can't raise it above the level in the tank. So if we go back to the temple, and if I wanted the water at the spring to get up to the temple, if I blocked off the spring and made it watertight, and there was a vertical shaft, then the water level would continue to raise in that shaft until it either reached the water level in the cavern or reached the temple. And if the temple is lower than the cavern, then the water will naturally flow out at the site of the temple.
North of the Kidron Valley is Mount Scopus, the probable location of the cavern. In the opposite direction, looking south from Mount Scopus, there is more than sufficient drop-off for the water to gather speed and momentum, generating tremendous water pressure. The combined siphon effect, along with the water pressure when it reached the southeast ridge below, created an upward thrusting of the water, much like the activity of Old Faithful. All that was needed to channel the water to the temple above was for the spring to be blocked off and a vertical shaft allowing the water an upward route from the spring below. In 1867, Sir Charles Warren, a British archaeologist, discovered such a vertical channel at the Gihon Spring. This unique water system brought a massive volume of water to the temple above, absolutely critical for the enormous and daily needs of the Levitical priesthood.
Jerusalem 3,000 years ago had nothing to commend it. Nothing. There was nothing there. There's rocks, there's mountains, there's hillsides. It is a terrible place to be. Why would you settle there? For one reason: there is fresh water. There's a spring. The spring is by what we now call the city of David. It is nowhere near the Haram where it is claimed that the temples were built. That's number one. Number two, in all the Jewish writings, it is claimed that the temple needs vast amounts of water. If you need vast amounts of water, you would tend to build the temple near the water, not hundreds and hundreds of yards away from the water, especially when this is not Roman times where they knew how to build aqueducts. This was 2,000 years before the Romans, when the ability to move water was impossible. So if you found a city near water, you build a temple near water. The only place to build it is where there is water, and the only place there is water is the Gihon Spring. There is no other source of water that can sustain any sort of community except the Gihon Spring.
Well, David, I think when King David looked out over this Kidron Valley and the southeast ridge and was looking at the city of the Jebusites, he was, I think, impressed and amazed at the amount of water coming out of the Gihon Springs and how formidable the city would be to conquer.
Well, water is life, and the Gihon is the only source of water within a 5-mile radius of this site. And you had to protect that. You had to build bulwarks, and the Jebusites had already done that. The problem was how to dispossess and get the Jebusites out of that water source so that it could then be the city of David and supply water both for the city and for the temple, which David probably had in his mind even back then.
But there was more to it than just the abundant water supply, and I think Josephus alludes to it in his writings.
Well, yes. Josephus says that the southeast ridge was protected by deep, deep valleys and made it impossible for this area to be attacked.
But these hills are surrounded by deep valleys, and by reason of the precipices belonging on both sides, they are everywhere unpassable. Flavius Josephus, Wars of the Jews.
This southeast ridge is like a natural fortress with its own water supply, and David would have seen this immediately. And that's why he coveted this area for his city and location for the Jewish temple.
I remember reading clearly that Dr. Martin pulled from a lot of sources, although he primarily used Josephus. Who were the other witnesses that he drew from history that could give us testimony about what this place looked like way back when?
Well, the other key witnesses were Aristeas from the late 3rd century, early 2nd century. And he was an eyewitness. He was a pilgrim from Egypt, and he came and walked this area. The other was the Roman historian Tacitus, who obviously worked from written records that were available at the time. But the most important source, of course, is 2 Samuel chapter 5, which tells us this area is the importance of this area.
And didn't the Jebusites, I remember that scripture, didn't the Jebusites actually mock David?
Yeah, they said that the blind and the lame could protect this city. It wasn't even necessary for strong men to defend this city. That's how strong the fortifications were.
Well, how did David manage to conquer Jebus?
Well, his associate, Joab, which was a relative of his, got up into the city with a group of men led by Joab, and they went up one of the water shafts in between the time of the propulsion of the water.
And by chance, strategically, the city of David now, but the Jebusite city, is very strategically placed. There are ravines around three sides. You can protect the southern side with a little fortress. You can protect the northern entrance, which is open by a northern fortress, and nobody can get in. Nobody. So it's a very well protected, strategic community which has water. That's why the Jebusites were there. That's why David wanted it. And it's a good place to build a city. And as a PS, if you have a god that you want to worship, you would build him a house right in the center of that city. The last place on earth that you would build a house for your god is way in the suburbs where nobody can protect it and where it's open to any sort of invader. The reason of going to the city of David is that you could protect it. Why then would you build something outside the city that you can no longer protect? Makes no sense.
You know, David, there's one last thing I've got to talk about, because to me, it's the creme de la creme of all that Josephus said in his writings in the Wars of the Jews. It's the cherry on top of the ice cream sundae. He said that the temple was built on a crescent-shaped ridge.
But the other hill, called the Acra and sustains the lower city, is of the shape of a moon when she is horned. Flavius Josephus, Wars of the Jews.
That's where the temple was. And you know what? We have evidence of that crescent-shaped ridge from satellite photos. Even though Simon tore down the Mount Zion and affected the whole area of the city of David, you can still see that ridge from a satellite photo.
Yes, Ken, and it's visible even from the ground. The crescent is still there for anybody to see. You can see it from the north, you can see it from the south, you can even see it from the east. Josephus was a reliable witness. He was an eyewitness at the time. And what he talks about is still there today.
Now, if you took just 3 of the statements of Flavius Josephus, you would have a perfect historic vector of right where the temple was, a pinpointed location of it. Josephus said that the temple stood on a ridge and stretched from valley to valley. That would be from the Kidron Valley over to the Valley of the Cheesemongers or the Tryphonian Valley. That's one vector. Number 2, he said that the temple was built over this gushing water system. That's the Gihon Springs, and that area was surrounded and protected by deep valleys and cliffs. And we've seen that. 3rd, he said that it would be built on a crescent-shaped ridge. Those 3 vectors pinpoint the exact location of the temple.
And Ken, you do realize what you're saying and the implications of it. Our location right now would be at the corner of the northeast portion of the temple, down the ridge, down the crescent.
But the greatest eyewitness of the facts came from Jesus. With great sadness, he stood on this mountain and prophesied that the glorious city Jerusalem would be completely destroyed. And then he said a long period of desolation would follow. He called that long period of desolation the times of the Gentiles. And Jerusalem will be trodden down by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. By this statement, he also indicated there would come a fulfillment and an end to the times of the Gentiles. But today, Jerusalem is still trodden down, a divided city occupied with Muslims, Christians, Armenians, and all kinds of religious groups. And the Jews are still without their temple. And so the prophecy of the times of the Gentiles being fulfilled has not come to pass. But the glory of Jerusalem will once again return, and the times of the Gentiles will come to an end once the temple is rebuilt. But obviously, until the Jews come to the conclusion of just where their temple belongs, well, we're just going to have to wait.